Lindsay-Jean received her master's in urban planning from the University of Michigan. Her education and passion for sustainability went on to inform and inspire her work in the garden, home, and community. Today, she works to build and connect new communities as a food editor and writer. She's the author of the cookbook Cooking with Scraps, as well as the Food 52 article of the same name. Welcome, Lindsay-Jean.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today and talk about cooking with scraps. Today, I'm going to go through a few slides with you and talk about food waste and why it's so important to be dealing with this issue. And then I'm going to show you how to make banana bread with the peel on. And you can feel free to drop questions in the chat box as we go. If they're really timely, I will answer them right away. Otherwise, we'll have a couple of periods to answer questions as we go along. So first, I want to clear up what we're talking about. What does cooking with scraps mean? And I want to be really clear that scraps are not the same thing as garbage. We're not talking about eating moldy food. We're not talking about going dumpster diving. Cooking with scraps is really just using underutilized produce parts and other odds and ends that are often discarded. So what does that mean exactly? So that could be stems from things like herbs and mushrooms and broccoli and kale. It could be the cores of apples and cauliflower. It could be rinds, like from cheese or melon. It could be peels, like from bananas or beets, or carrots, or citrus fruits. Tops, like from leeks or leafy greens from carrots and beets. And then it includes a lot of other odds and ends too, like aquafaba and coffee grounds and pickle brine. So if this concept seems familiar to you, it's because it likely is. This is not a new concept by any means. You know, across the ages, across lands and cultures, people are no stranger to making the most of with what they've got. But there has been a renewed popularity in reducing food waste, which is great because for those of us who are in a position of privilege enough that if a recipe says to cut off and discard a kale stem, that we're able to do that without thinking, you know, talking about this more is a good way to help us retrain our brains and think about why we shouldn't be doing that. So I work at Zingerman's Bakehouse here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I will talk about that more in a little bit. But one thing that's unique about Zingerman's is that we have a triple bottom line. So we talk about the importance of great food, great finance, and great service. And I like to say that cooking with scraps has that same triple bottom line because it's good for the palate, it's good for your pocketbook, and it's good for the planet. So the palate is the first and foremost most important thing. At Zingerman's Bakehouse, we say that flavor is first, and that's the same thing with cooking with scraps. This has to taste good, or I wouldn't be telling you to do this. The next thing is the pocketbook. That cooking with scraps can really make a big financial difference. There's an estimate that families of 4 can save anywhere between $1,600 to $2,200 a year simply by not throwing away food. That's obviously a huge deal. But the third part of this, the planet, is the one that I want to spend a little bit more time on today and talk about why this makes a difference. So first, a couple definitions. Surplus food is all the food that goes unsold or unused by a business or goes uneaten at home. So that includes food and inedible parts like peels, pits, and bones that are donated, fed to animals, repurposed to make other products, composted, or otherwise anaerobically digested. Food waste is the uneaten food and inedible parts that end up going to landfills or incinerated or disposed of in the sewer or dumped, all of which could be consumed. So the estimate currently is that 35 to 40% of food in the United States goes uneaten. It's obviously a huge, staggering number. So a very small portion of that surplus food is donated or recycled. The vast majority of it becomes food waste. So the next thing that everyone wonders at this point is, well, where is this waste happening? And it really happens at every level across the supply chain. So it's food that's left in the field, it's food that got damaged in transport from the farm to the grocery store, it's food that's not sold at the grocery store or isn't pretty enough to make it out there. It's also waste at restaurants, and it's waste in our own homes too. And the discouraging and encouraging fact is that the majority of this waste is happening at the consumer-facing businesses, so grocery stores, restaurants, and in our homes. But that also means that we have the power to make a difference and change this, starting in our own kitchens. So the food waste is actually the #1 material that's entering landfills right now. It makes almost a quarter of the landfill input. And what's really especially bad about this is that food going into landfills doesn't have any oxygen getting to it. There's no sunlight. So it's not breaking down like it might if you have a compost in your own backyard. It's creating methane gas in these landfills, which we know has a huge bad impact on our environment. So the methane gas piece of this is terrible, but it's also the resources that are being wasted, that, the food took resources to grow, to harvest, to transport, to cook. So we're wasting all of those resources when we're disposing of it. And I hear a lot of these facts about food waste, but I still manage to be stunned myself. One of the ones that really shook me was when I watched the documentary Wasted, and they talked about a single head of lettuce going into a landfill and how long it would take to decompose. And I want you just to sit and think about that for a second, and how long it might take, like week, a couple weeks, a month, a couple months. It can take up to 25 years to decompose. So it's really concerning. We really don't want this food going to landfills. So one helpful tool that I like to share is this EPA food recovery hierarchy. And you can go to the EPA's website and read more about all of these levels. But you see that the landfill is really the last resort for this food recovery. There's some surplus food waste is inevitable, but the goal of this all is to get food out of landfills, and we want food to be going to the highest and best use. So really, we want food to be eaten by people. You'll see that at the top in blue. And whatever we can't get to people, then we'll use it to feed animals. And then we want to be diverting stuff for industrial uses and to use to create energy. And then the next best is composting, which I also think is interesting, because sometimes we think composting is, this great savior, and composting is wonderful. I compost, it's great for my garden, but that's not the top use for food. We really want it to be feeding people and animals before we want it to be going to the landfill. So now I want to take another minute and give you all a pop quiz about some food scraps and read through this list, and then if you feel like sharing in the chat, let me know what you think isn't edible. So we have apple cores, avocado pits, banana peels, beet greens, broccoli stems, carrot greens, cheese rinds, coffee grounds, corn cobs, green potato peels, kale stems, moldy bread, orange peels, pickle brine, pumpkin guts, rhubarb leaves, stale bread, bean liquid, watermelon rind, and zucchini stem. So you can share in the chat, or you can just think about it to yourself. If you've been listening closely, you already have gotten some answers on things that are edible, but I'm curious which ones you think are not edible.
So Lindsay-Jean, we've got a lot of answers in the chat. It looks like folks are thinking moldy bread, coffee grounds, corn cobs, avocado pits. Someone says, I think this is a trick question and it's all edible.
I like where that person's head is at. It's only kind of a trick question. There actually are 3 items on this list that are not edible, but it really is meant to remind you that a lot of the things that we discard are completely edible. So those 3 items that are not edible are moldy bread. As I said at the very beginning, I'm not encouraging anyone to eat things that are moldy. Moldy bread is one of those. Anything with visible mold on it, other than cheese, which we can talk about more later. But moldy bread you don't want to be eating. Rhubarb leaves are poisonous, so don't eat those. And then green potato peels also have a toxin in them that you don't want to eat. It is okay to completely remove the green part and still eat the rest of the potato though. So for the rest of them, I will briefly go through how you could be using these, and we can talk about more items at the end too, or if you have additional questions on any of these. But apple cores are edible. You don't want to eat apple seeds. Those also have a toxin in them. You would have to eat tons and tons of apple seeds for it to likely impact you, but it's something that's better safe than sorry, and you want to avoid those. But the core itself is edible. So you could collect a bunch of them in a Ziploc bag and save them and use them to cook down and make applesauce. You could cut your apples a little bit differently so that you're really just getting rid of the seeds. One of my colleagues eats apples from the bottom up instead of around the side, the way many people I know do, and he literally eats the entire apple other than the seeds and the stems. So it's another example of, how we learn things and just changing the way we think. Avocado pits are also edible. I actually have 2 growing in my windowsill in my kitchen right now to try and grow my own avocado plants, but you can also eat them. You can dry them out and they can be used to make a special kind of liqueur. And then I've also heard of people adding them to smoothies. I have not tried this, but I would only recommend this if you have a super high-powered fancy blender to blend those all out. Banana peels, as I already mentioned, are edible. We're going to be using those today to cook with, and I will talk about more when we get to that portion of it. Beet greens are edible. Things like beet greens, carrot tops, radish greens, those are all completely edible. And are really delicious. A lot of the times they can be used ways you might use other sturdy greens like spinach or Swiss chard. Broccoli stems, this is the one that I think I've started to notice the biggest shift with in grocery stores, encouragingly so. It used to be that you would just get the crown of the broccoli, and more I'm seeing the entire broccoli with the stem being sold, which is great for reducing food waste, but also broccoli stems are delicious. I love the flavor of them. Really, you just need to peel off the toughest outer layer, and then the inner stalk can be used exactly how you'd be using the rest of the broccoli. Carrot greens kind of can sometimes have a bad reputation for being poisonous. I don't know where that started, but it's not true, perhaps because they're slightly bitter. But if you blanch them for a few seconds in water, that can help cut the bitterness. And carrot greens actually make up a couple of my favorite recipes in my cookbook. They just have a really unique, delicious flavor. Cheese rinds are edible, with the exception that you don't want to be eating any man-made products. So if you buy cheese that's wrapped in wax, or if it has any other plastic around it, don't eat that part. And then don't eat anything like, sometimes you'll see little bits of bark wrapped around cheeses. So not those additions, but the cheese rinds itself are completely edible. I like to keep a couple of freezer bags going in my freezer at all times with cheese rinds because they are delicious to add flavor to soups or a pot of beans. And then you can also just collect little odds and ends of cheese that if you have a party and you don't quite finish the cheese board, you can throw all of those into a freezer bag. And when you get enough, you can blend them all together with a little butter or cream cheese and turn it into a cheese spread and not waste all of that delicious cheese. Coffee grounds are also completely edible, and they have a lot of coffee flavor left in them. We here at my house, we make a French press pot of coffee every day. So we go through a lot of coffee grounds. We do use a lot in our garden and our compost, but that still leaves us with a lot. So there are a couple of different ways that I like to use coffee grounds. One is that I like to mix them in with nut butter. It adds a little bit of texture and a little coffee flavor, which is lovely. And then I also have a recipe on Food 52 for a French silk pie that includes coffee grounds. And I'm using them two ways. I'm using them in a chocolate cookie crust, again, to add flavor. And then I also use it to steep whipping cream with, and then make a coffee whipped cream topping for the pie. So that's delicious. I will note that they do still have caffeine in the grounds if you are using caffeinated coffee. So think about the time of day that you're enjoying what you make with them, or use coffee grounds from decaffeinated coffee. Corn cobs, I will give you all, is a little bit of a trick question because you probably wouldn't want to directly bite into a corn cob, but they still are very useful. You can use corn cobs to create a corn cob stock that then you can use for soups or risottos. And especially if you're cutting the corn off of the cob, you really want to do a great job of scraping down those cobs first because there's still a lot of corny goodness still on there. Kale stems, you'll remember I mentioned earlier, those are one of the things that I think is easiest for us to look at a recipe and it'll say cut off and discard the kale stem, and we might not think about it, but they're completely edible. Depending on what you're making with your kale, a lot of the times you can just finely chop up those kale stems and cook them first. Like if you're cooking chopped up onions, cook them with the onions before you're adding in the kale leaves. It's also, you can use them to, you can make pickled kale stems. Orange peels, this might be one of the easier ones. I think a lot of people have had candied citrus fruits before, so that's a great one for using orange peels for. But also one nice thing to do with citrus fruits is to zest them. If you know you're just going to use lime juice or lemon juice, take the time to zest them before you juice them. And then I use ice cube trays for everything in my freezer. So this is a great example of that, of putting a little bit of citrus zest in ice cube trays, freezing it, and then transferring it to an airtight container for later use. So you're not wasting any of the zest from those citrus fruits. Pickle brine is incredibly versatile. In my cookbook, I share recipes for using it in a Bloody Mary mix and a potato salad. You can even, when you finish a jar of pickles, you can use that jar to re-pickle something else. So dunk another round of vegetables in there for some quick pickles. You could put hard-boiled eggs in there for some pickled eggs. Pumpkin guts, this is a really seasonal one. Pumpkin guts are edible. I know a lot of people, myself included, save the seeds and roast those, but we don't always think about the stringy, fleshy guts on the inside, and that is edible as well. In my cookbook, I have a recipe for using those in scones. So it's not that different from using like applesauce or a banana puree. It's adding moisture to baked good. You can also use pumpkin guts and like squash peel to make a squash stock. That's delicious for soups and risottos. Again, know that they're a little bit starchier, so your stock will be a little bit murky from those, but it'll taste delicious. Stale bread, I keep freezer bags in my freezer with stale bread too. I keep some torn up into big crouton-sized pieces, and I grate some down into breadcrumbs. It's a really handy way to add texture and flavor to dishes and not let your stale bread go to waste. Of course, you can also do things like bread pudding and French toast with them. Bean liquid, or aquafaba, is the liquid that comes in a can of beans, like when you drain your can of chickpeas. And chickpea liquid is the one that's most commonly used in recipes, but you can use the liquid from any beans. You can also use the liquid from when you're cooking beans yourself, but if you haven't worked with aquafaba before, I would recommend starting with the liquid from canned beans. It's just a little easier and more consistent to work with. But that liquid is really interesting because it can function like an egg in baking recipes. So it can be used to help make dishes vegan. And it also whips up like an egg white can. So you can use it to make like meringues with. I use it in my cookbook to make a mayonnaise. It's a really fun thing to play around with. Watermelon rind, any melon rind really, you wouldn't want to be eating that thin outermost layer. But the white layer, the thick white layer rind, is completely edible. Watermelon pickles are a pretty popular use for it. I use it in my cookbook to make a watermelon granita, which is a really refreshing icy dessert. And then zucchini stems are also edible. This is another one similar to kale stems. I feel like most of us cut this off without even thinking about it. And if it looks really dried out, you might want to cut off that top sliver, but the stem is completely edible, just like the rest of the zucchini. It tastes like zucchini. It's just a little bit of a different texture. So, as I mentioned, I work at Zingerman's Bakehouse, and this has been one of the really exciting parts of my food waste journey, because we can all make a difference by talking to other people and sharing these things, but this has been an instance where I felt lucky to be able to make a difference on a larger scale. Zingerman's Bakehouse, before I started working there, was really focused on reducing waste, but not necessarily food waste. But since I've been there, we've made some exciting changes. We no longer peel the apples in our apple pie. It adds color and texture and more nutrients. We don't peel carrots for our carrot cake. There's really no need to ever peel carrots. A lot of your flavor and nutrition in a lot of fruits and vegetables is going to be in the skin or very close to the surface. So you want to avoid peeling them if at all possible. You just want to scrub them well, obviously, and whenever possible, if you know you're going to be using the peel of something, it's great to be able to choose organic or to be able to talk to the farmers where you're getting these things from to learn about their growing practices. They might be using organic practices, even if it's not labeled that way. We also don't peel the peaches in our peach pie. We use leftover coffee from our bake shop in our gingerbread coffee cakes. We make a lot of chicken salad, and so we don't let those chicken bones go to waste. We make our own chicken stock that we use in our soups. And then recently, we've really been getting into milling our own grains. So stone ground flour crushes the whole grain kernel, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. And so that releases all of those vitamins and minerals and oil into the flour versus commercial white flour, which is just the starchy endosperm of the grain. And then the piece that I'm most excited about personally is our banana bread that we bake. In my cookbook, you will find a recipe for banana cake that uses just the peels of bananas. It's delicious. It's my daughter's favorite recipe in the book, and it's modeled after a cake that my grandmother used to always make for me. But from the time that the cookbook came out to the time that I started working at the bakehouse, I learned that it's a lot easier, instead of cooking the banana peels, as I direct you to in the cookbook, to just freeze them. You can freeze either banana peels on their own, or you can freeze the whole banana, peel and all, which is what we're now doing at the bakehouse to use in them. So it was really exciting. I used the Zingerman's Bakehouse banana bread recipe. I made a couple batches of it using the whole fruit, peel and banana, and I brought them in to everyone to try. And across the board, everyone was very skeptical of this. You know, it's that mental piece that I talked about, that it's different and we aren't necessarily used to it, even though in other cultures, a lot of people do eat banana peels. But everyone tried it and everyone loved it. And so we made that change across the board. So now all of the banana breads that we make use the whole fruit. So it was exciting because not only does our bread taste better, we wouldn't have made that change if it didn't, but it's also really decreased the amount of food waste that we're producing at the bakehouse, because as you might guess, we make a lot of banana bread. So I've touched on this a little bit, but a big piece of how you can make a difference is simply by making changes in your own kitchen. Part of that is what we were talking about with the EPA hierarchy of reducing the amount of surplus food created. So at home, that means buying less or only what you need. And a really easy way to do that is by meal planning. It's something that I resisted a lot personally, because I love to go to the farmer's market and buy whatever strikes my fancy and just wing it. But I realized that I can strike a balance between that, and I can still go to the farmer's market and buy whatever strikes my fancy, but then it helps if I come home and plan out what I'm going to do with all of those things. And then I'm only buying what I need to fill in the gaps. Another thing is thinking about what happens when that plan changes. So not as much when we're in the middle of a pandemic, but sometimes we'll have friends or family say, well, let's go out to dinner, which is awesome, except you already had a meal planned. So it helps to take a moment and think about that. Like, will all of these ingredients hold for another day? Can I make this tomorrow? Or do I need to do something with it to make sure that it doesn't go to waste? Should I roast these vegetables and then freeze them so I can use them later? Another really helpful thing to do is to give yourself a day of the week where you just do a quick check of your fridge and your pantry, just to make sure you remember what's in there. It makes it a lot less likely that you're gonna have a head of lettuce turn into a puddle of green slime at the back of your crisper drawer if you're checking on things regularly. And then, of course, I hope that my cookbook, Cooking with Scraps, can help also. I designed it to be a reference guide. So it's organized from A to Z. I created really simple recipes with fairly short ingredient lists, because I know that this topic can feel overwhelming if you're just getting into it. And so I want to make it as easy as possible for people to start cooking with scraps. And my cookbook is also purely focused on the scrap itself. I figure if you're buying the beets, you probably already know how to use the beet, but you might not have ideas for how to use the greens. So I hope that these recipes can be nice jumping off points for you to get ideas of how to use it and then really make these recipes your own. And I love this quote from Zero Waste Chef. It says, "We don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly." So give yourself a little grace and know that your best is good enough. Changing the food system really can start in your own kitchen. If you're cooking, you're more likely to be making wholesome choices and you're more connected to your food. The more you know and care about your food, the more likely you are to eat sustainably. And the more sustainable you are, the less food you waste. So I recommend picking an item or two to start with and work your way up from there. And maybe you want your item to be bananas. That's what we're going to start with today for our banana bread. So as I mentioned, in the cookbook, you'll see that I have you cooking banana peels in a little bit of water to soften them. But the freezing process takes care of that and reduces your dishes, basically, because the freezing and thawing process is expanding those cell walls and it's softening the banana peel for you. And then you don't have to cook it. So this is an organic banana, and it was already really ripe when it went into my freezer. So it looked like the kind of banana that you want to make banana bread with, which is what you're going for. A green banana will technically work, but it won't give you as much flavor. And then I pulled it out this morning. I put it in my fridge to thaw, and then you're just gonna pinch off that the top stem part is just really hard, as is this little bottom part. And we are actually making Zingerman's Bakehouse recipe today, and we will share that recipe with you. But you're starting with this banana, and then you can either do this in like a small food processor. I like to use an immersion blender. It's less messy and it just works well for one single banana. And you're just gonna blend this. So I'm gonna be a little loud for just a second. And I'm sure you saw that my banana was very black. It didn't go into the freezer looking like that. It looked like a banana ready for banana bread that was yellow and very mottled, but it turns black in the freezer, and that's completely fine. It doesn't affect how your banana bread looks in any way. And then after I don't want to lose any of my banana that's trapped up in that immersion blender. But you will see, you can still clearly see specks of banana in there, which is completely fine. That won't show up in your banana bread. It'll just look mottled like a normal loaf of banana bread does. And before I did this, the first thing I should have done was to preheat my oven. That's always the first thing that you want to do when you're baking. Because even though I just redid my kitchen and have a new fancy oven that beeps at me when it tells me that it's preheated, it is not actually preheated to that temperature. This is one of the most important things to know for baking, that a lot of the times your ovens are off, even if they're brand new. So you always want to give your oven 20 to 25 minutes to get up to temp. And it's really helpful to have a freestanding oven thermometer inside of your oven so you can see what temperature it's at and then adjust from there. When we have people have issues at home with recipes, that's almost always the cause, is that their oven temperature is off. So my next tip for baking would be to invest in a digital scale. This is mine, it's nothing fancy. I think it's like $20, but baking by weight is always going to be much more accurate than baking by volume. So if I asked every one of you right now to measure out a cup of flour in a volume container and then we weighed it, everyone's answer would be completely different. And that's not a reflection on any of you as bakers. That is just a reflection of the inaccuracy of measuring cups in general and measuring by volume. So if you have to measure by volume with flour, the first ingredient that we're going to start with, I would recommend fluffing it up with like a spoon or a whisk and then spooning it into your measuring cup and then leveling it off. That'll help you to get a more consistent result. But for the best result, I recommend measuring. So you would start with your scale. I measured out 140 grams of flour. The really nice thing about measuring with a scale also is that you can use the tare button and it zeroes it out. So you're also going to get fewer things dirty because you can just keep adding things into this as you go. So to our flour, we're going to add some baking soda. And we're also going to add some fine sea salt. Sea salt or salt in general is another thing that can have a surprising amount of difference on your baked goods. And I'm just whisking these together. So you really want to use what the recipe calls for. There's a big difference in saltiness levels between things like sea salt and kosher salts, especially even between brands of kosher salt. So you want to use what the recipe calls for. So these are my dry ingredients. I'm going to set those aside for a minute, and then I'm going to combine my wet ingredients. So I have 163 grams of sugar. I'm going to add my banana puree. I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of vanilla extract. I would make sure you're always looking for vanilla extract that is not imitation. You want all of your ingredients to be as flavorful as possible. I am using a vanilla paste just because it's what I have on hand right now. It doesn't matter at all for the banana bread, but in some dishes, I really like using vanilla paste because you can see those little flecks of the vanilla bean, which is just a nice visual addition. We're also going to add 1 egg. I always recommend cracking your egg into a separate container for a couple of reasons. One, it tells you really quickly if you have a bad egg or not. That's really rare, but it does happen. And that way you're not impacting the rest of the ingredients that you've already measured. And it's also easier to get the shell out if you're doing it on its own. And it doesn't matter in this case because we're only using 1 egg, but those issues can just compound if you're doing multiple eggs. So keep them all separate, add them 1 at a time. And you saw I cracked on the flat surface. You want to do the flat surface rather than cracking on an edge, because cracking on an edge, you're more likely to get a piece of shell to break off and go in, and you're more likely to contaminate anything that was on the outside of the shell and getting it inside of the egg. So it's nice to just avoid that too. Then we're going to add in the egg. And then we're also going to add in melted and cooled butter. And we're going to whisk these together. For this, I know I've been harping on using the weight of things. I did not measure out my banana, and that's one aspect of this recipe that does have a little bit of wiggle room. Unless your banana is really tiny or really, really large, 1 banana should be just fine without being really precise about that weight. And then we're going to mix the wet into the dry. And we want to stir just enough to make sure everything is moistened and we don't have clumps of dry ingredients, but we don't want to continue to mix after that point. It doesn't do anything beneficial to the bread, and it actually could end up making it tough. That's the case for all quick breads and muffins. And when you're mixing, you want to make sure that you're not only getting the sides, which are really visible, but that you're scooping up and under too. This can happen pretty easily with mixing things, especially if you're using a stand mixer. That bottom piece can hide some of those dry ingredients, and you'll be pouring it into your baking dish, and you'll see that you have a clump of ingredients down there that didn't get mixed in. This is also the point if you were using like an add-in, like some chopped nuts or some chocolate chips, you could add those at this point. And then at the bakehouse, we use this smaller size loaf. So that's what I'm making it in today. And it's coated, so it's pretty nonstick, but I'm just gonna give it a little extra spray of nonstick cooking spray just to make sure. So assuming you don't have these smaller loaf pans at home, you have a couple of options. I will also sometimes make this in a standard loaf pan, and you're just gonna get a little bit shorter, squattier loaf, which is fine. It still tastes delicious. Or you can double the recipe. A standard loaf pan will hold double this recipe. It's just gonna take longer to cook. I would start checking it at about an hour, but it'll probably take more than an hour, maybe an hour and 5, an hour and 10 minutes. And so now I have my stuff in here. You can see those pieces of banana peel, but they're all really chopped up, and it will be delicious in the final result. So we're gonna pretend that my oven is already preheated, and I'm gonna pop that in. And then through the magic of TV baking, you can see my finished loaf of banana bread. And I will even take this out and cut it so you can see what the inside looks like. So you can see it looks just like a regular loaf of banana bread, maybe a little bit more speckled in there, but it's delicious. You are not wasting food. You're adding some additional nutrients in there, and no one has to be the wiser, or they can be. It's up to you.
Lindsay-Jean, we've got some questions about the recipe you showed us. Can I pass them on to you?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we've got a question here. Can canola or other oil be substituted for the butter in the banana bread?
Sure.
And would that be a one-to-one substitution?
Yes, it would.
Great. And we also have another question. How ripe should your bananas be before you put them in the freezer?
Ideally, you want them to look like the bananas that you would grab to make banana bread. So you want them to be very ripe with brown spots on them.
Great. And we've got another question here. How quickly after peeling do the banana peels, need to be used? We've got someone wondering if their banana peel from this morning is still usable.
Their banana peel from this morning is definitely still usable. I don't know if I have a timeline of, like, I wouldn't leave banana peels out on my counter for hours and hours, but that's partly just because we get prone to fruit flies in the warmer months. But yeah, you can eat your banana and pop the peel in an airtight container or freezer safe zip top bag, and just have bags of banana peels in your freezer too is fine.
Great, thank you. And let's see, speaking of putting things in the freezer, do you have any rules of thumb for putting stuff in the freezer, like things that you should cook or prep before you freeze them versus just popping them in the freezer as is? What are your freezer recommendations?
Yeah, so one of the things to consider is that most of the time we don't want to be putting, there are a lot of fruits and vegetables are better if we cook them first. This banana is the exception. We really want the banana peel to soften, so that freezing and thawing action of expanding the cells and then contracting helps us. But like, you wouldn't want to put cucumber in there or other really watery things, like watermelon isn't great for freezing because it's really going to change the texture and not in a positive way. I also avoid freezing like really heavily dairy-based like soups. Like, I would make the soup up until the point of adding the dairy in and freeze it that way, and then add the dairy afterwards, again, because it can impact the texture of the final product.
Thank you. And we've got someone asking, they say they love to use whole fruits and veggies, but do you have any inkling about sort of the pesticides level in some of these peels that folks might be using in their whole fruits?
Yeah, so there's actually a report done every year called the Dirty Dozen that you can use to look up and see the items that are grown with the most pesticides, and also they have a list for the ones that are grown with the least pesticides. So that can be a big overview to help you decide what you might want to be using the peels of and what you might not want to. Like I mentioned, I also really recommend, whenever possible, talking to your farmer, going to the farmer's market and speaking with them directly about their growing practices, so you know what they're doing and how those items are being grown. You always want to be washing things off and choosing organic when possible. I know that's not always possible. It's also a budgetary constraint for people. But some things like you might avoid using those then if you couldn't get organic or talk to the person. Like I always buy organic bananas now because those are one of the things that tend to be grown with more pesticides. Pineapples are another one that I have a recipe for in the book that uses the pineapple peel. I love pineapple, but you do create a lot of waste when you're cutting it to get at the fruit. So there's still a lot of pineapple flavor in there we want to get at. But again, pineapples are one of the things that are generally grown with a lot of pesticides. So if you're doing that and cooking the peel to get more flavor out of it, you want to be buying the organic pineapple.
Thank you. And we've got someone asking if your cookbook has any stock recipes in it.
It does. It talks about both vegetable stocks and meat stocks, what items to use, what items you might want to avoid. So yes, absolutely.
Thanks. And we also have a question. What's the easiest way for home cooks to deal with food scraps that are not consumable or that they can't use? So composting and things like that. I think especially coming from DC, we've got a lot of folks who perhaps live in apartments and might not be able to chuck their apple core in their backyard.
Yeah, so I can't speak to DC about this, but a lot of communities do have options for composting at a citywide level, or there might be organizations that would take compost materials, even if it's not a city program. And in those cases, if you're able to, I would recommend like collecting stuff in your freezer. Just having a zip top bag of all of the things that you would like to be composting. I have a compost bin that just sits out on my counter, but it's also because I have a compost pile in my backyard. So the compost isn't staying there for very long before it goes out into my backyard. If it's going to be longer times between when you're able to drop that compost off places, then it helps to keep it in the freezer to reduce any possible odors or fruit flies, things of that nature. Also, depending on how committed to this you are, there are options that work for apartment living, like worm composters. There are small things that you could be doing in your home.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay-Jean. And those are all the questions from our audience today. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Lindsay-Jean, for sharing your amazing knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for having me.